Good evening. This presentation is about a concept called water poverty, which was attempted to popularize, first develop, of course, and then popularize in the year of 2002. And this presentation is also based on the paper written by Sullivan on this concept of water poverty index. So Sullivan argues that everything needs to be understood in the context of measurement. If you want to understand how particular regions or particular countries, particular districts are water poor, or if you want to understand how much water is available for different kinds of uses in particular regions, you need an indicator. You need something which would tell you, something which would allow you to rank, something which would allow you to compare across regions as well in terms of availability of water. And one needs to also understand why these kinds of concepts are needed, or why these kinds of measurement oriented approaches are needed, because it becomes a tool for policy making. If a particular region is lacking sufficient water, if particular regions has sufficient water, so of course one has to discuss about the very basis of how you are going to decide sufficiency, and there you can assume certain levels of water consumption. But say you arrive at a particular figure about how much of MLD, or how much of meter cubes, or 1000 meter cubes, or whatever is the unit of measurement, is the requirement of that particular region based on the water use, then you can compare. And but how to arrive at that particular unit, how to arrive at uh, a particular figure or particular number which would reflect the consumption levels of particular regions or particular countries, states, districts, even village, even habitation. And then you compare, because finally she argues that policies for development and environment are evolving as tools of behavioral change. And then such uh, measures or such methods developed on the basis of measurement oriented approaches can even become regulatory tools, which can further be helpful to command a certain kind of behavior or change in the behavior towards water consumption of that particular country or even population. One such measure became very famous recently, especially in after 2002, which is, I think all of us which is known as footprint, especially the water footprint, because in 2002 Arjun Hoestka, he was working at UNESCO IH Institute for Water Education, and he created this water footprint as a metric to measure the amount of water consumed and polluted to produce the goods and services along their full supply chain. And then this footprint idea became so famous that everyone started applying it in different contexts. So not just water footprint, gray water footprint, carbon footprints now, because it helps you to monitor the consumption. If it helps you to monitor the amount of a particular resource being generated or used or saved, and it can be used in different directions and all, and it is easy to understand, so it becomes a powerful indicator about a particular resource consumption, and it helps also you to compare. And in that sense it also becomes then a regulatory tool, because by comparing footprints you can understand the consumption, you can get into using that metric which was developed. Also you can get into the comparative analysis or understanding of consumption of water for different kinds of activities, different kinds of products, and then it helps you to prioritize what is to be produced, how much water should be consumed for what kind of activities, and then you can actually command certain behavior through the regulatory tool. So here, when Sullivan talks about behavioral change, she is talking about behavior of the society towards water use, behavior of the industry, behavior of individuals about actual water consumption. And I think she uses the term poverty because she believes that to many people the word poverty is synonymous to poor quality of life, and hence the word poverty is used in different contexts, each of which emphasizes some of the many dimensions of quality of life. The traditional uses of the word poverty refers to income poverty, which commonly entails defining an income poverty line below which an individual household is deemed to be poor. The United Nations Development Programme, in its 1997 Human Development Report, introduced the concept of human poverty that considers the deprivation in three important uh, aspects of life. But when poverty is associated with quality of life, and when water is associated also with quality of life, the conceptualization here comes from Sullivan and the team as water poverty to indicate that lack of sufficient water to maintain the quality of life. So another point she wants to make here, that any kind of policy making, and effective policy making, needs to have some kind of accurate monitoring, and that accurate monitoring should not be based on uh, indicators or understanding or perspectives developed from a particular discipline, but it has to be an interdisciplinary science. And then here she tries to develop, or attempts to develop, I would say, an index based approach to understand the water poverty, in which she would consider range of other indicators, and um, those indicators would then be um, culminated through some kind of an calculation to come out with one particular number which would tell you everything about that particular region in terms of water availability, use, scarcity, etc. etc. And she says that such indicators generally are not available in the water sector, and hence um, she says that one needs to develop a particular indicator which would tell about overall a general situation of water for a particular region. So she also discusses some general issues with the then existing indicators. Now remember, she is working now in year of 1990s to 2000. That's the decade she was rigorously working. I think she was supported. Her work was supported by Department of International Development of the United Kingdom, and she was leading a project in which she was trying to understand the water scarcity and its impact on development, poverty, etc. etc. And in that endeavor, she came out with this particular idea of water poverty. And then she talks about certain limitations of the existing indicators. She talks of one indicator which is very famous and which has been used across the countries in everyday measurement of economic development or economic growth. I think all of you know these indicators, which is GDP, the gross domestic product, or the GNP, the gross national product. And there is a small difference in GDP and GNP, that GDP is the product, meaning the value of goods and services produced in a particular country within the boundaries of a nation, and the which includes also importantly the production of goods and services by foreign or multinational companies, but within the boundary of a country. And gross national product is then the value of goods and services produced by the companies in and across the world, owned by a particular uh, country or a nation. Another index she talks about is the greenhouse gas index, which tries to go towards environmental assessment. Then the sustainability indicator she talks about, Pierce and Atkinson developed it in 1991, which was aimed at um, understanding the sustainability in general in the context of economic development, including the natural and man-made capital. I mean, by taking these both types of capitals into consideration. So she says that while many of these indicators allow policymakers and funding agencies to monitor the progress of environmental change or poverty elimination, she critiques that none of these, however, recognizes the unique importance of water to all forms of life. So, obviously, she is trying to generate an argument where she wants to defend or justify her approach towards developing some kind of an indicator for understanding the water situation of particular regions or countries. So you can, I have been saying again and again, regions, countries, habitations, villages, district, states, whatever it is, because when you develop such concepts or when you develop certain indicators, one needs to also take into the consideration of different scales at which those can be applied. But her argument is not just about understanding water situation. Her argument is about understanding the water situation in the context of development, in the context of elimination of poverty, in the context of increasing income levels, in the context of facilitating development. And then she argues that without adequate and efficient water supplies, and by that she means where there is water poverty, so water poverty, no adequate supply, she equates it with that. And she further says that any measure to reduce income poverty are unlikely to be successful. Now, I don't need to discuss here in the fourth semester about the centrality of water for any kind of economic production. Whatever you produce, whatever you consume, any kind of good or services, I think water is at the bottom, and water is at the center. And that's why I think since first semester, I don't know about others, but I have been again and again saying in every course which I teach that one of the objectives of this program, the entire Masters in Water Policy and Governance program, is to bring this argument at the center of everyone's understanding. What is the argument? That water is at the center of the development process of any any country. So at the center of the development process, meaning then one has to consider water first before taking into consideration any kind of developing activity which is essentially an economic or socio-economic uh, activity. So the objective of developing a water poverty index is to produce a holistic policy tool. So she aims to make it as a policy tool. Another very famous index. All of you know that, the Human Development Index. So HDI of India versus HDI of Bangladesh. Nowadays, every now and then people compare it. You take newspaper articles or you take journal articles, academic articles. The comparison of Bangladesh and India in terms of Human Development Index is very popular, and often it comes as a claim that how Bangladesh, being a smaller country than India, has gone far ahead in terms of achieving human development. So HDI has become a very powerful tool to compare the level of human development, which is not only confined to the economic aspect of development, but it also considers other qualitative aspects of human life. One can always say that yes, HDI is a powerful tool. HDI is a tool, a holistic tool to understand the human development. Now, I don't want to get into the critiques of whether HDI is a reflects the true situation of development or human development or not, because critiques can always be there. But I just wanted to bring this as an example in our discussion because it has become a powerful tool and it is easy to understand. It gives or creates a particular picture of a certain community in terms of what score that community or a village or a city or a region has been given in terms of HDI. So even in the case of water, she wants to develop a holistic tool which draws on both the physical and social sciences. So when she says physical sciences, she basically intends to get into the accurate measurement of water consumption, which comes from essentially engineering or natural science sides, and the social sciences about quality of life. So she says that drawing on both the physical and social sciences and having application throughout the world. So varying degrees of situation. Now look at the ambition here. Look at the vision here, that each country from any continent might have a different levels of development, different levels of water consumption, different levels of climate, and I think I need not even get into the minor details of the diversity in terms of the endowments each country has. But the ambition is that drawing on both physical and natural and social sciences and having application throughout the world. Further, she writes, it is hoped that the development of such an index will enable decision makers to target cross cutting issues in an integrated way. So, still, there is a very, very heavy kind of, I would call it as a pressure, but here it comes as an ambition, or here it comes as a vision, whatever it is, of the integrating everything into one particular figure or number in an integrated way by identifying and tracking the physical, economic, and social drivers which link water and poverty. Now, the linkage between water and poverty has to be at the core of this kind of an index, and we will come to know soon when we will get into the method she developed for, you know, calculating the water poverty index. And then I would like to have your own understanding, opinion. You can write me, because this is going to be a recorded lecture, about what do you feel, or even when you will do the assignment for part of this course, you can have a section in your assignment about your own critical understanding about the method as well as the vision behind water poverty index. And we are also going to look at some critique on WPI, especially by Peter Molinga and Francois Mollet. So what the WPI would do? Her proposal is that water poverty needs to be quantified in a universally accepted way. Now, many people who have different ontological positions, we had discussed all of this in the research design class, whether you are a positivist or post positivist, or would you do you believe in multiple realities, or interpretivist, etc., etc. I'm just flagging this so that some kind of that connection can or should also come in your mind. But her seems to be much more positivist, right? So her proposal is that the water poverty needs to be quantified in a universally accepted way through the derivation of a water poverty index. What it would do? It would enable progress towards development targets to be monitored, and the water projects to be better targeted to meet the needs of the current generation while securing water availability for the needs of future generations as recommended in the Brundtland report. So, the index will also enable decision makers to target cross cutting issues in an integrated way by identifying and track the physical, economic, and social drivers which link water and power. So, see, people, I find this really very, very ambitious. You're taking everything even to the aspiration of a sustainable development. Now, I don't blame uh, definitely, or I am not being overcritical here, because anyone who would try to generate some kind of an indicator and dream that our indicator or the indicator which that team is generating should become a relevant policy tool would definitely embrace the definition of sustainable development. Because if you want to see whether water is available to meet the needs of current generation and then future generation, etc., etc., then it is talking really, or it is trying to capture really a very, very large and complicated canvas. But anyways, so she says that this exercise of WPI should be based on the critical assessment of indicators or indexes from three areas. One is the poverty indicators, which are already there. Second are sustainability indicators, and third are the water assessment indicators. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of which poverty indicators, sustainability indicators, or water assessment indicators she considered and evaluated before arriving at the composite water poverty index. That is not the idea here. I leave it to you to read, but she has been trying definitely to be enough comprehensive. That's what I am trying to emphasize here. So the idea here is that WPI should begin with understanding of the relationship between water use and economic development. And she gives a chart in her 2002 paper where she compares the GDP per capita of different countries in dollars, and also she places against the GDP the annual water withdrawals meaning actual withdrawal from different kinds of sources, maybe rivers, lakes, dams, groundwater, etc., etc., both for domestic and agricultural purposes. And then she also gives the total figures, and she takes examples from African countries, Asian countries. She takes examples of well developed Western countries, from Europe, including the US, and Basically, she tries to establish the association between water consumption and development, and she shows that there is a simultaneous increase in standard of living and population, which can create actually the water scarcity, because more the consumption, more the economic development, more the chances are of getting into the water scarce situation. And economic development and water use is thus very closely linked, which is not a new thing for us, although, but anyways, water resource availability or lack of it is linked with economic and social progress. Unfortunately, this table doesn't have any example from the Middle Eastern countries or North African countries, the MENA region countries. But if one looks at the development profile of these countries, one can even understand and see that how and what levels of water withdrawals are, because these are less endowed countries, I would say, in terms of water availability. And then she also reiterates this well established argument that the development is likely to be influenced by how water resources are managed. But all in all, the effort here is to understand the relationship between water use and economic development, as she says. Then also she talks about, you know, the WPI should also cognize, take into consideration the links between water availability and water demand. And in this another table, she compares different countries in terms of distribution by sector, as she says, of annual water withdrawals, where how much water basically is withdrawn by domestic, for domestic purposes, how much water for industrial purposes, how much water for agricultural purposes. Obviously, again, this is not a new thing for us. By now, all of us know that agriculture is the biggest guzzler of water, especially irrigated agriculture. And whether it is Egypt or whether it is UAE, whether it is, see, these are all the MENA region countries. And she compares this also with the world averages, and that also, comes as an indicator that these less developed, sorry, less endowed countries, and hence may be less developed as compared to the western developed world, because their water endowments are less, and whatever endowments do they have, those are getting consumed in producing food rather than industrial consumption. Again, it shows the association between the water and the level of development or the level of quality of life, especially through economic industrial development. And also she tracks the growth trajectories in a way, not tracks, I would say, comments in a way implicitly of these countries. So, and she claims that the demand management is then one of the real challenges faced by policymakers today, and definitely policymakers of these countries are under immense pressure to regulate the water consumption behavior of different sectors. And further, she says that on a global scale, water for agriculture is by far the most important use, with domestic water requirements being just a fraction of the total consumption. But pressure is increasing, scarcity is looming, and again, by saying that, she is coming back to us with an argument that one needs some kind of a holistic indicator to make quick and effective decisions about commanding certain behaviors to ensure the sustained or sustainable water use. She comes back with these arguments to the existing indicators, and she argues that the existing indicators A aren't interdisciplinary because those have been shaped or designed, or those reflect a particular disciplinary thinking. So, human development index, poverty lines, poverty gap, these kinds of indicators are purely economistic, those lack the social, natural, engineering, physical sciences. There is no reflection of the thinking or the kind of rationale those disciplinary thinkings would create. But one needs to go beyond that. And but economic accounting in general does not address the issue of natural capital utilization. So water is one of the natural capitals in terms of the way natural capital is conceptualized. And further, she says that other efforts like water balance assessments also have certain kinds of limitations, as those only focus on resource but not the capital aspect of it. Now, if availability of resource vis-a-vis conceptualizing them as capital, because capital is an economic concept. Obviously it reflects its use particularly in the sense of investment and the returns on the investment, because capital is generally employed for some kind of production activity. But when you consider natural resources as resource rather than the capital, your entire approach towards management of the resources are different. So for example, in the context of say watershed development project, if one conducts water balance assessments, I am not saying that that water is not being used for productive activities like food production or any other small scale or tiny scale industry at the watershed level. No, I'm not saying that. But the approach is not that, like when you employ money or invest money and see the returns. So she is talking about finer disciplinary sort of angles which actually do not give you a holistic comprehensive understanding of uh, measuring or how to measure the levels of development and association of resources and capitals, etc., etc., if you go by one particular discipline. So while HDI, poverty line, or water balance assessment, GDPs, GNPs, whatever it is, those are very popular indicators. She further says that those do not consider interesting and important social aspects. Of course, HDI does up to a certain extent, but obviously she would always claim that that is not enough, and especially because there is no water, she is anyway going to argue that. But her list includes aspects such as the time spent by women in subsistence households. I mean, whether that is a productive time, whether that is a time which is non productive, how it is linked with economic activities, how it is linked with the level of development or quality of life. There are gray areas, as she understands. In some developing regions, she says that as much as 25% of the woman's productive time can be spent on water collection. So we know this, but her argument here comes in the context of that no indicator basically captures these elements. No indicator basically understands that the time spent for collection of water by women actually can impact the overall capability of that households to produce economic goods which would fetch value and improve their quality of life. And I think same she argues that this represents a significant cost in terms of household human capital entitlements, but little has been done to quantify these real household costs, and even less to account for them explicitly in economic analysis. So, all of this is basically to interlink the water sustainability and poverty economy angles. And the overall argument is here about how to integrate water accounting in economic analysis. And this economic analysis can be at the household level, because water is a key component of natural capital entitlements of households, as Schoons says. First, the definition of water data itself is necessary. There should be some kind of accuracy, some kind of clarity, that in which units, for what activities, at what level, at what scale, for what time, all of these, at what place. So all of these dimensions needs to be brought in together to bring good kind of water accounting. And there are practices. I am not saying that engineering or natural sciences have not produced such methods, but those needs to be integrated with the economic accounting system, because finally you are using water for producing some kind of economic value. And finally your indicators or understanding about the level of development is essentially economic, where water should reflect. So this is also, the argument is important or critical to understand and aim at sustainable development. And then this needs to be addressed, this need to integrate water accounting and economic accounting, or bring them together, is basically for uh, um, make the entire accounting practice more holistic. And obviously, we know the concept of, for example, e flows. Hmm. Likewise, here is what she is also talking about, that the water requirements for human consumption, or water requirement for producing economic goods and services is not just which needs to be integrated into the accounting practices, but also the ecosystem water requirements as a component of the it should be the component of analytical framework which would be used for the calculation of the water poverty index. So considering a that water should be integrated or water accounting should be integrated into the economic accounting systems, and water accounting should also have a component of ecosystem water. So both angles she is basically talking about, which is explained in this first bullet of this slide. Now, she also tries to consider that the man made capital is generated. I mean, the very fact that the man made capital is generated from the depletion of natural resources, because when you save or you generate value and save, because in purely economic sense, savings becomes the capital, which then further employed into the economic activities, but that capital is generated always by the use of natural resources, and in which the depletion of the natural resources does happen. And this can also be shown that certain natural resources cannot be reproduced by utilization of financial or physical capitals, because I mean common examples of for example fossil fuel, and sometimes it can also be water, mainly because when you are considering water as although a renewable resource generally, but if you are accessing deeper and deeper aquifers which take years of time to replenish, it can have this angle of what she is talking about, the same character which the fossil fuel has actually. And since she's talking in terms of economic development, where there is a concept of substitutability of the factors of production, so you can substitute a resource if it is becoming scarce with the resource B. But when it comes to water, there is absolutely problem, right? Water is essential, and water cannot be substituted as a factor of production, meaning in our language as a resource which gets employed into the production business, then that aspect also needs to be integrated somewhere in our understanding of sustainability, because finally the aim to produce a tool as water poverty index which would help policy making and regulating the behavior of people in water consumption. So, by highlighting both of these aspects, the need for integrating water accounting into the economic accounting, the need for integrating the ecosystem water requirements into the economic accounting, or of course also water accounting, and then this very fact that water has a different angle when it comes to substitutability of the factors of production. She further says that you know these resources, whether water or other natural resources, on the basis of which actually the money or the human capital or is developed, hmm, those are undervalued, and this undervaluation also needs to be understood if one needs to understand the policy failure. And to justify this argument, she further gives references that how many water projects have been developed in the past have failed or have not lived up to the expectations, and there are simultaneously numerous examples exist of inequitable development outcomes in terms of the water projects. So, after talking about the deficiencies in the thinking in terms of integrating water and sustainability with poverty or economic context, she further moves on to the existing deficiencies in terms of interdisciplinarity in specific indicators which have been developed for understanding or creating or assessing the scenarios of water consumption, water availability, etc. etc. The first example she talks about is the uh, a particular indicator developed by Stockholm Environmental Institute, which is quite famous because it is the mean annual runoff. And she talks that the key concept in this approach is the assessment of total water resources at the country level in terms of the mean annual runoff, and the runoff values were based on the observed data from river flow measurement stations. I think some of this Purnanjali has used in her own dissertation. And then this river flow measurement has been supplemented by estimates based on the meteorological data where river flow observations were lacking. So, but whatever it is, I mean, the supplementary data and the actual measurements then are calculated in the form of the mean annual runoff, and the mean annual runoff then becomes a very good indicator, as argued by Stockholm Environmental Institute, of the total water resources at the level of a country. Another example she talks about is GWAVA, the Global Water Availability Assessment, which is a method based on the grid approach for calculating the runoff. So, not based on the way SEI developed, but this entire region is distributed into the grids, and the water runoffs are calculated at the grid level at the first stage, and then reassessed or aggregated at the entire region or country level. But still the key concept remains at the level of assessment is the runoffs. Another very interesting method developed to assess the total water resources is at a global scale. So the entire world has been distributed into 55 into 55 square kilometer grids, with the grid cells grouped into a total of 1162 catchments, providing almost total global coverage. So the calculations are done at the grid cell level, but the results are aggregated then to at the catchment and the country scale. And again, the method is same. The method is about calculating the runoffs. But she critiques all of these indicators because the indicators stop at giving the availability assessment and do not link this with, say, economic or social issues like poverty, like access, like drudgery, etc. etc. All of this was basically to understand the entire logic or rationale which she tried to develop. One, by emphasizing the need to have a holistic index. Second, by pointing out the disciplinary versus interdisciplinarity context, which is associated or not associated with the existing indices or methods, and also then pointing out certain deficiencies of indicators like what ACI had developed, a GWAVA model or the water gap model. So after giving so much of, I mean, this is based on the paper which we have referred and I have also uploaded in the TISS by Sullivan. Then she talks about actually the basic considerations for developing a composite index. So, what is a conventional composite index approach she has taken, and how it has been applied to develop the water poverty index? So, in this, we are only going to look at the very basic calculation of water poverty index just to understand the concept or idea. She has developed at least 3 or 4 or more variants of calculating the index based on different other types of data and different components or elements which she has considered. I do not intend to go into the details of all of that, because again I would like to limit here at the perspective level, because this is a discourses class or discourses course and not a method kind of a course. So if one is interested further, we can further interact about it, or I can provide you more details in terms of detailed understanding of about the calculation part of the water poverty index. But because I am limiting here at the perspective level or at the discourse level, I would just explain this as a method and then end this particular lecture. So Sullivan here takes a composite index approach, and those who are not familiar with the index or indices, let me tell that composite indicators are mathematical combinations or aggregations of a set of indicators. So those are based on sub indicators. So because it's composite, it combines other indexes or other indicators in a staged manner. So those are based on sub indicators that have no common meaningful unit of measurement. So obviously indexes or indices are based on assigning certain weights or different weights to different indicators. You know the concept of weighted average, right? So composite indicators are based on the sub indicators that do not have a common meaningful unit of measurement, and there is no obvious way of weighting these sub indicators. And the example which we are going to look at here is based on various elements, meaning indicators for these various elements. For example, water availability, access to safe water, clean sanitation, and time taken to collect the domestic water. Now, she has discussed some of these elements in the earlier discussion when she was comparing existing indices in the economics or development side, or even the water assessment side. And she pointed out that some of these elements are missing, and hence the existing indicators or indices are not comprehensive enough, and hence she tries to bring these elements in the calculation part. So before I get into this the formula, I mean formula is anyway pretty clear. If you read, you will understand it. I would also like to talk a little bit about the increasing use of indices in the developmental assessment in general, because there are certain pros, certain useful aspects of indices. Those can summarize very complex and multidimensional issues, and those are increasingly being used to assess the country's performance in a particular sector, particular policy arena, because the very character of this indices is that it can bring in different kinds of elements where there is no common measurement method is available, and that's why those can become subjective, but those can still become useful. Those also offer sort of a rounded assessment, of performance or of situation or of use or efficiency, and then make or enable to make judgments on the performance aspect of countries or administration or departments, etc., etc. These are often used for benchmarking or ranking as well. But there is always danger of or danger with the index approaches also, because if those are not enough robust, those can send misleading policy messages, because the picture though that the index would generate or the meaning index would convey can be very subjective, because when you assign weights, there is an issue with how and what weight should be assigned for what element is always subject to different opinions or differences or even debate. So those involve judgmental decisions and sometimes also create issues of transparency, etc., etc. Because measurability is an issue, and if something which is more qualitative, which can't be measured in purely numbers, then actually the entire calculation of the index becomes more complicated or complex and subjective. So that element one needs to consider before getting into the actual formula. Coming back to the slide and coming back to the water poverty index formula, here we are looking at that if one considers these four elements of water availability, access to safe water, clean sanitation, and time taken to collect domestic water, this would result in a formula like WPI equals to WA capital A plus WAS, each of that is explained below, plus WT, that is time, in bracket 100 minus T, in which the capital A is the adjusted water availability. Because water availability is an essential element of the calculation, the adjusted water availability assessment in the percentage form, and it is calculated on the basis of the ground and surface water availability related to human, in which basic, domestic, industrial, and agricultural all kinds of uses are considered, plus ecological, in which the value of A should also recognize the seasonal variability of the water availability. And in this way, you arrive at a total water availability figure, which would be then expressed as in percentages. The capital S is the population with access to safe water and sanitation. Of course, again reflected in the percentages, because you are calculating an index here. And the capital T is then the time, hmm, time and effort taken to collect the water for the household. So again expressed in the percentages, the T is the structure used to take account the negative relationship between the time taken to get water and the final level of WPI. In simple sense, more the time household spends in collecting water, less it would be productive and hence it has to be expressed in a negative sense while calculating the water poverty index. So if one looks at the illustrated example of calculating, since A, S and T are all defined to be between 1 and 100, and then W small a, Ws and Wt are between 0 and 1 to produce a water poverty index value between 0 and 100, the formula needs to be modified as the following. Obviously, this is a weighted average. You know the concept of weighted average. So there are going to be different weights for A, S, and T here, and then WA, WS, and W2 reflect the weights, and that's why the value should be between 0 and 1 for the sake of calculating the formula. So the formula comes here as water poverty index is equal to 1 by 3 in bracket WA capital A plus WS capital S and WT in brackets 100 minus T. Their last bracket is mistakenly not there, but there should have been also one closing bracket in the formula. Apologies for that, but that's the formula. And if you look at the numerical example which has been actually shown in this slide, which has been directly taken as a screenshot from the paper. So in this example, for a region A, or for any region here, just an alphabet has been used to denote the region. The values for A, S, and T are 60, that means 60% availability of water, and similarly 20% for S and 30% for T, and the weights have been assigned to them as 0.5, 0.25 and 0.25 respectively. So the availability gets more wet here as compared to the other two elements. And then referring to the equation, the actual formula has also been illustrated. That is water poverty index for region A equals to 1 by 3 into bracket and into sub bracket 60 into 0.5 uh, bracket complete plus another bracket 20 into 0.25 plus 0.25 in bracket 100 minus 30 and the small and the big bracket complete, and this entire calculation comes up to 17.5 and gets the index points. That means the water poverty index for region A is 17.5. In this slide, similarly, the water poverty index has been calculated for region B as well, where the values for S and T are different than the region A, and thus as per the assigned weights which are constant, obviously for whatever number of countries you choose, the water poverty index comes for region B as 60. Obviously, water poverty index numbers or the values shows that the higher the value of the WPI, the lower the degree of the water stress. So region B has a greater degree of water poverty than A. So B is water poor than region A. You can develop this concept and you can have more number of elements and longer the formula for calculating the water poverty indexes. So earlier was a small illustrative example just to explain the concept and approach towards calculating the WPI. Here she also talks about an alternative approach, which is the gap method, known as gap method, in which water poverty index measure could be to consider the assessment of by how much water provision and use deviates from a predetermined standard. So, if we take the earlier example of having a standard for the time spent in collecting the water at the household level, and if the standard says that more than 5% of the time of the household if spent in collecting water, then it is detrimental to the economic welfare of the household. And then, if you find that at a region level or a country level, the average time spent in collecting the water is 30% or 20%, then you can see the difference between the standard and by how much actually it has been deviated, and then consider that deviation and integrate it into the assessment. So you can have considerations for many elements, a few elements as an example she has given on the slide, like ecosystem health, community well-being, human health, economic welfare. So if you take these four elements based on the gap method and try to calculate a water poverty index, then you get something like this, which is shown on this slide. So although she doesn't have a predetermined standard, she says that for say ecosystem health, the predetermined standard could be based on the biodiversity, waste assimilation, and resource depletion, because all of these three are the characteristics of ecosystem health, and that could also then include a measure of water availability. She also gives symbols for that, and likewise for human health, likewise for community well-being, likewise for economic welfare. She talks about that how these predetermined standard could be decided. So for the standards of ecosystem health, the symbol is EH. For human health, symbol is HH. For community well-being, symbol is CW, and for economic welfare, it is simply EW. Now, this actual empirical value means according to the standard and according to the ground reality, if you calculate and come to some number. Conceptually, we are speaking. We don't have, I mean, right now, neither she nor I are talking about what method would you employ to assess the ecosystem health, what method you would employ to assess the human health or other two elements. But whatever, I mean, whatever that method is based on certain disciplines, where these elements come from, you assume that after assessing the situation, you get some empirical value and you have a standard now. So for each of this element there are standards. Standards are denoted by EH, HH, CW and EW, and actual empirical value is then denoted here with a symbol AEH or AHH, ACW or AEW, quite simple. And because you want to assess the gap, because you are talking here in terms of how much the situation is deviated from the actual standard. You know, simple, I'll take a very different and very simple example. So, on an average, CBSE schools in Pune have a passing percentage of 90% at the 10th. So 90 has become some kind of a standard, because if you look at the data for say 50 years and calculate that how many, what percentage of students can pass 10th standard, it is on an average 90. So in that sense you have fixed 90 as a standard, and hypothetical I'm saying. And then if this year's situation, if you want to see, it comes for each of the school differently. Some school, in some school the students, only 70% of the students could pass, in some schools 75, 80 and likewise, and then you would assess the gap for each of the school. So likewise here the poverty gap is simple, EH minus AEH, because AEH also is the actual empirical value which you get after assessing the situation on the ground. You will get the gap. In similar way, for each of these other elements you will get the gap. And then the final water poverty index will not be one single value as per this method, but an index made up of the four values. Again there would be weights, and each part of which may be expressed either quantitatively or qualitatively depending on the data and the indicators used. So she says in the note, which is very important, using this approach water stress is highest when the water poverty gaps are largest. If the situation improves, the gap gets smaller. So that's what her experimentation with the gap method and combining it with WPI she could produce. So I hope this recording would be useful for you, and you could have some idea about the approach towards calculating the water poverty index, fundamental presumptions, the entire debate around weightages or assigning weights, the subjectivity which might be involved in assigning the weights and which can also distort the paper, distort the actual outcome of the assessment. But well, at certain time this was getting quite popular, and many people who think in terms of quantitative assessments, who believe that numbers, measurements actually reflect the realities, and based on these approaches there should be some kind of index or indicator which can be used to inform policymakers about uh, the situation and then prompt them to take proper actions or proper policy measures. I think indexes like WPI might be of some interest. I would stop here and I'll try and come out with another but smaller recording in which we will discuss some of the critiques of WPI index and how WPI index actually could produce quite a distorted picture and why it can become or it has become a giga kind of a method. Giga means garbage in, garbage out, because if you change the weights, if you change the data values, you change the outcome. So whether it is enough rigorous, whether it is really useful, or whether it was a futile effort. So critics are quite strong on such approaches, and we'll also try and understand them in our next lecture. Thank you very much.